Okay, so welcome Dr. Bork to our presentation tonight for LEPS, Langley Environmental Partner Society, and our engaging in our project in terms of the EcoAction in climate and water quality within our three watersheds, which is the Bertrand, Little Pepin, and more. So Dr. Bork is a very important person. I have seen him in other presentations. He is the chair in the Rangeland Ecology and Management and serves as the director of the Rangeland Research Institute at the University of Alberta. We're very lucky to have him. He has been teaching and conducting range research for more than 20 years on a wide variety of basic and applied topics, including integrated weed control and pasture, grazing systems, fire ecology, forage agronomy, landscape production dynamics, and agroforestry. Most recently, he has been leading studies examining the role of grasslands and cattle grazing in providing alternative environmental goods and services such as carbon storage, greenhouse gas reduction, and biodiversity retention. He and his students have given numerous technology transfer talks over the last decades. Dr. Bork has maintained close ties with the agriculture industry in which he and his family continue to reside and operate a mixed grain and beef operation northeast of Edmonton, Alberta. So without further ado, I will leave that to you, Dr. Bork, and you can go along with your presentation. Are you okay with questions at the end of the talk, or would you like them throughout?
I'm okay either way. It's really whatever you prefer. If we want to keep a good tempo, then maybe we'll hold them to the end. But if someone has a real pressing question, they can fire away. I'm okay either way, really.
Okay, I will watch for the hands up. Okay,
great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you, Amanda. Thank you for the intro. Thank you to Langley Environmental Partners for the invite. So what I'm going to do this evening is try to go through kind of a Coles Notes summary of, I'm squashing together at least 3, maybe even 4 really large research programs that have been ongoing for upwards of 10 to 12, maybe even 15 years in some cases, and trying to give you some highlights as to the work that we've been doing, looking at carbon sequestration and specifically the importance of grasslands, how land use activity, and one of them that I'm really interested in, of course, is grazing, and even agroforestry influence those carbon stock levels. You'll be seeing a number of pieces of data. I won't dig into the data too much, but hopefully I'll use them effectively to create some important points. And before we even get into some of the more nuanced aspects, I want to just talk about the overarching research goal. So why have we been working on this? And it's not just me. You would have seen on the title slide, there's lots of other individuals, there's lots of graduate students, there's lots of other researchers that have participated in this. So this is very much an integrated collaborative approach that we've been going through. So the overarching research goal is really to build a business case to allow producers, so ranchers and farmers, to be able to get paid for environmental goods and services. And the only way we can do that is if we can show the size, the magnitude, and the quality of the environmental goods and services. And we've been doing this with not just carbon, we've been doing this with biodiversity and all kinds of different things. But what I'm going to focus on today is really carbon and greenhouse gases. So the goal is really provide an empirical foundation. Empirical is important because it means numbers. We need quantitative data that policymakers can use to basically say, oh, a given land use, whether it's grazing or the retention of grasslands or agroforests, will lead to X amount of carbon that they are maintaining or enhancing, increasing. And so that's really where we want to go. And the reason we're doing this is because up until now, farmers and ranchers are largely not getting paid for carbon storage. And so because we don't have the data to justify and for policymakers to really create those incentives for them to get paid for that carbon, that's a problem. That's a barrier, because it means that farmers and ranchers will not incorporate those environmental goods and services, including increasing carbon storage, into their thought process when they make their day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year management decisions. So we want to quantify the size and the stability of the carbon stores in these ecosystems. We want to understand land use change. So if we decide to plow under our grasslands, so cultivate them, or get rid of all the agroforests that we have, how might that change carbon storage? And so I'm going to show you some data to highlight how we're making progress on that front. And in other cases, we're using land management changes to fine tune or to try to tweak the carbon level. So whether it's altering the stocking rates of cattle or biochar addition, those types of things also change carbon stock. So you can think of those as best management practices that we're trying to fine tune what we're doing out there. So I'm going to break my presentation up into a series of questions, and then I'll show you some data and try to make the argument as to how these different types of land use activities are really important, and BMPs that we can, as producers and land managers, actually influence carbon stock. So the first question is, what's the role of grasslands in storing carbon? It's the most basic one that we have to start with to highlight just how valuable are grasslands to society for storing carbon, and what happens if we as a society or an individual farmer makes the decision to plow that under and convert those grasslands into annual crops. So we had a study that started in 2012, went on for 3 to 4 years. We call it the carbon benchmarking study. We sampled 106 grasslands, which is a lot of grasslands, and you can see them distributed here in the map on the right. So they went all the way for basically the Saskatchewan border, clean up into the foothills, almost into the national parks, and from roughly Edmonton all the way down to the Montana border. So it covered a lot of different agroclimatic zones, variable in soils and vegetation and climate and management potential. And then at each one of these sites, we also looked at the carbon stock under both grazed and non-grazed conditions. So there's a couple examples here. This is Harold Creek from the upper foothills, and this is a long-term exclosure where livestock grazing have been excluded, and we basically quantified carbon stock inside and outside. And then here's another one from Schuler, which is down north of Medicine Hat in the dry mixed grass, again, inside and outside. And then we had a companion study running at the same time where we compared carbon stocks in existing non-cultivated native grasslands. So that would be an example on the left here. And then also in tame pastures. So tame pastures are areas where in the past, at some point in time, the producer made the decision to plow under that native grassland and then decided to plant introduced forages. And then we also had a third comparison where we had cropland. So these areas are typically managed in rotation, wheat, canola, barley, that type of thing over time. So want to talk about some of the highlights of the results. So the first one is just to get our heads around how much carbon do these different native grasslands contain. And it's very large. For example, even the mixed grass prairie of southeastern Alberta, so those grasslands that you'd find in around east of Lethbridge, all the way through that Medicine Hat, Brooks area, they contain 50 to 60 tons of carbon per hectare. So if you took 1 hectare, 100 by 100 meters, you added up all the carbon that's in the soil, in the plants, in the dead and decaying matter, in the microbes, would be roughly 50 to 60 tons of carbon per hectare. Our mesic grasslands, so the wet grasslands in southwestern Alberta and even central Alberta here, the Edmonton area, have upwards of 150 or even 180 tons of carbon per hectare. So these are large pools of carbon. Most of this carbon is in the soil organic matter, which is why you hear all this talk about biological carbon storage within the soil matrix. And these estimates that I'm providing you with today are actually quite conservative because we didn't sample all the carbon. We only went down to about 30 centimeters soil depth. So we know there's more carbon below that depth. It's quite a bit of a smaller pool of carbon, but there is more carbon down there. So these are underestimates. But if you start then multiplying that by how many millions of hectares of grassland there are, you start to get an idea just how large these carbon pools are. And I'll show you a little bit later just how big some of these pools are. Another thing that we found is that the mulch layer, which is that transitional layer on the surface of the soil where live plants that aren't eaten by herbivores, they start to, at the end of the year, they senesce, they turn brown, they then start to decompose on the surface of the soil. And some of these grasslands, especially the wetter grasslands, higher rainfall grasslands, had upwards of 15 tons per hectare of this carbon. So that's a lot of carbon. So in aggregate, the native grasslands had upwards of an average of 90 tons of carbon per hectare. So it's a lot of carbon. Only a little bit of that carbon is live vegetation and roots. Most of it is dead vegetation and that soil organic carbon pool. Okay, the other thing we found is where we did our comparisons of grasslands to the adjacent cropped areas. We found that there was a large reduction in the size of the carbon pool. And the size of the reduction really varied depending on whether you were in the more arid part of the region, the province, such as, you know, that mixed grass zone in southeastern Alberta, or whether you were in the parkland zone up here in the Edmonton area where I am. So in the prairie region, we lost roughly 28%. You can see that the decline from about 80 tons per hectare of carbon down to about 60. So that's a lot of carbon to lose. And in the parkland zone, we lost even more. We went from about 130 tons all the way down to about 70, 80 tons. So, you know, and you might be wondering, why does that happen? Well, there's something that Walter Wilms, who was a colleague of mine, he was a range scientist from Lethbridge. He's now retired, but he always called it the furnace effect. And I love that term. So what that means is when you cultivate a soil, you start to oxygenize it. So you're adding oxygen, aerating it. You're also heating it up because you're removing the insulating layer, which means the microbes are happier. The microbes start to break down more of that carbon. They release more of that to the atmosphere. So he calls that the furnace effect. Of course, it's not getting burned off. It's getting respired off by microbes. And so this is what we're seeing, this reduction of 30 to 45%. And our declines in Alberta are very consistent with what we see globally. So it doesn't matter if you're looking at grasslands in Europe or in China or in Argentina, you see about 30 to 55% of the carbon disappear. Excuse me. Okay, so the other thing we wanted to do basically a spatial exercise. We wanted to ask the question, what's the lost value of the grassland carbon stocks? So if we take this land, we plow it under, and we combined our carbon stock data from our 106 sites with ABMI data. This is the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute land use framework. So they have spatial data for the province. And by doing that, we were able to actually figure out how much carbon and what's the value of that carbon that's currently in grasslands that could be lost through further cultivation. So the at-risk carbon is here on the left. So if we look at the number of millions of tons of carbon currently in grasslands that could be lost if we cultivate, it's large. So in the prairie, it's roughly somewhere around 75 million tons of carbon. In the parkland, it's still pushing 60 million tons of carbon. And the value, so, and these are underestimates in terms of value, because these are based on a $30 per ton CO2 equivalent. So every ton of carbon has a value, and the federal government tells us what that value is. My graph here is based on $30 a ton, and right now it's $50 a ton. So these numbers are actually much higher than that. So what's at risk right now is roughly not $15 billion like I'm showing in my graph. it's actually more like $25 billion worth of carbon. So I know it's hard to get our heads around the size of, or the value of these carbon pools, but it is absolutely enormous. The numbers are even more staggering when you look at what's already been lost, because most of Alberta, most of the prime farmland, which was once grassland, represents a net loss of carbon. So for example, in the Parkland zone up here by Edmonton, where I am, the amount of carbon that's been lost is in excess of 200 million tons of carbon. That's a lot of carbon. At the $30 pricing, that was worth about $22 billion. At the $50 per ton CO2 equivalency, that value will be much higher, more like $33, $35 billion. So we're dealing with huge valuation on the carbon that's actually been lost from these agroecosystems. Okay, so question 2. Now we're getting into the more nuanced aspect of asking, how does land use alter carbon? So does grazing increase or decrease carbon? So if we have cows running around on these grasslands, do they actually take away carbon, or do they add carbon, or are they carbon neutral? Like, what's going on here? So because we had measurements inside and outside each one of these benchmark sites, we were able to quantify the amount of carbon. And what was interesting is if we look at the soil carbon concentrations, we actually found a net increase of about 12% in the topsoil. In the top 6 inches or 15 centimeters of soil, we observed a net increase in the amount of soil carbon, which is interesting, raises the question, why or how? How are cattle actually increasing soil carbon within these grasslands? So before we get into the how, and I will answer that question, I promise. So the increases in total ecosystem carbon stock were magnified with grazing in the higher rainfall areas. And so this graph here basically breaks it down in terms of aridity. So the mixed grass prairie on the left or on the right, you see basically no change in carbon. So the cattle are out there, they're converting forage into protein, but there's really not much of a change in the carbon stock. But when you get into the higher rainfall areas, the Parkland, which is around 350 to 400 millimeters, we see a larger net increase in carbon. Same thing within the foothills and the montane environments, where now we're well over 400 millimeters in rainfall. And again, we see that net increase with grazing in terms of carbon. Again, we went back to the ABMI data, the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute data, because they have the spatial land use footprint for Alberta of what areas are subject to grazing. And this paper isn't published yet, so you're seeing it before it's even published, but I think it will be of interest. And we computed the net changes in carbon simply because we have grazing going on as a land use. And this summary bar graph here actually shows the grazing-induced change in ecosystem carbon. And it's quite striking when you look at, for example, Aspen Parkland, where we have a net increase of roughly 8.1 million metric tons. So this is million metric tons of carbon. And that carbon is worth approximately 1,200 million Canadian dollars. So that's 1.2 billion Canadian dollars. Again, these numbers are enormous. If you add up all of these bars, the total increase just by having grazing at a light to moderate stocking rate in the landscape appears to have increased soil carbon by 17 million tons in Alberta. And the valuation of that carbon is in excess of $2 billion in aggregate. So these are enormous numbers in both in terms of the amount of carbon and the value of that carbon. And also keep in mind, and I'll make this point at the end of the talk, that the current carbon valuation is not $50 because it's going up all the time. And it's scheduled basically to sunset at $130 per ton of carbon. So imagine how these economic values will increase by the time we get to, what is it, 2030 or somewhere around there. Okay, so third question, how does grazing alter carbon storage? The reason why my colleagues and I want to know how grazing alters carbon stores is because once we know how, we can go back to producers and we can tell them how to fine-tune their management in order to increase the amount of carbon stock. And if they're able to do that, they should be getting paid for that ecosystem service because they would be helping offset part of the rising CO2 that we have in the atmosphere. So how is also important. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these slides, but I've tried to distill them down into one slide Cole's notes and give you one takeaway message for each one of them. The first one is to understand that grazing actually alters the plant community. It changes the type of plant species that are there. And light to moderate grazing by cattle or even wildlife actually increases plant diversity. So the plant diversity, this is a grassland in southwestern Alberta in the foothills, lots and lots of wildflowers. Many of those wildflowers actually rely on grazing to maintain their presence. So that might be a part of it. The other one is that by increasing forb mass, so forbs are broadleaf plants, this is called a structural equation model. It's just a fancy statistical way of trying to figure out what's driving soil carbon, which is on the right of this diagram. The linkages that we want are to understand how grazing, the presence or absence of grazing, actually alters that carbon. And what this diagram tells us scientifically is two really important things. One, the presence of cattle increases diversity, specifically the abundance of these broadleaf plants, forbs, and that actually favors an increase in soil carbon, interestingly enough. The other one is this path through the bottom that I've highlighted here at the bottom, which is that grazing actually increases the quality, so the decomposability of the grasses and sedges within these grasslands. And that's represented by having a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. And that in turn also increases soil organic carbon. So there's two really interesting pathways, biological pathways, for how grazing might increase soil carbon. Another one is we've been doing lots of studies looking at carbon cycling, and there's literally 4 to 5 years of data encapsulated in 4 bullets on this slide. So bear with me. The first one is having cattle or livestock or of any type on a grassland actually leads to more rapid decomposition of litter. So the dead material on the surface of the soil actually breaks down faster. And we also found that because you have grazing animals, you get this increase in grazing tolerant grasses, and they actually break down more quickly. And that may be linked to an accumulation of soil carbon. Another one, and this was surprising to us, and maybe a little disappointing to those that are really looking to retain native grasslands, is that some of our agronomics, one of them being Kentucky bluegrass, Poa pratensis, which is very widely naturalized. It's not so much planted, but it's naturally invading into a lot of our foothills, a lot of our parkland, and even into our mixed grass prairie grasslands. But very consistently, where we get this invasion by Kentucky bluegrass, we're seeing an increase in soil carbon. So there is something going on there, whether it's providing more biomass, more carbon inputs, or whatever it is, more carbon turnover back into the soil, it is enhancing soil carbon. We also know that the presence of grazing alters the soil microbial community. And of course, those microbes are what's processing and turning over carbon. So that may play a role. And we also see changes in the activity of those soil microbes as evidenced by changes in enzyme activity. So all of these different things suggest that there are changes due to herbivory and the presence of herbivores on carbon cycling. Another one that we've actually tested is there's a lot of notions that regenerative grazing or pulse grazing, where we take animals, we confine them into small paddocks, that it may actually lead to enhanced carbon flow below ground. I know that there are researchers in Australia, for example, that are strong advocates for this, and we've done some of this work. So what we're interested in looking at is, does the exposure to grazing above ground actually increase carbon flow to this massive root mass that we have below ground? And just to be clear, the majority of biomass in grasslands is below ground. It's not above ground. Upwards of 80 to 85% of the biomass is actually below ground. So as a manager, we're typically managing below ground biomass, not above ground. We want to consume above ground biomass, or we want our livestock to consume it, but we're managing the below ground biomass. And what we've found is that where we use these pulse grazing events, so controlled intensity foliation, the plants are more likely putting more carbon below ground. And those pulses of carbon below ground may actually be helping enhance carbon stock. So that's another avenue that we're working on. We've also actually done some very direct work on adaptive multi-paddock grazing. So I've defined it on this slide here. So we call it AMP grazing, this adaptive multi-paddock grazing, which is where producers take a larger area, they subdivide it with fencing into a much smaller pasture. They put in elevated stock density so that more animals, but for a very short period of time. So they concentrate all of their grazing into, in some cases, 24 hours or even 12 hours, and in other cases, maybe 3 to 4 days. And then they move the animals out and they give those pastures a really long rest period before they come in for a second pass. There's lots of other names for it: holistic grazing, mob grazing, planned grazing, and it's also a component of regenerative grazing. And our data is actually suggesting from sites across the prairies that the producers that are using these pulse grazing systems, AMP grazing, are actually producing more plant biomass. The plants are growing to a greater extent, and therefore, because they're growing more, there's more plant inputs, and that means more carbon input. And that's the ultimate source of the carbon accumulation. It's coming from plants. So if we can increase forage productivity through something like AMP grazing, that might be a very important role. We also have done work looking at water infiltration rates, especially here in the prairies where water is a really limiting factor. We just came through very significant drought in 2021. And many of these grasslands that are managed with adaptive multi-paddock grazing actually have higher soil water infiltration rates, which is really good because it means that when you do get rain, the soil takes up the water faster and it can be captured, held in the soil, and made available for plant growth. So it isn't lost due to runoff or evaporation from the soil surface. And the combination of more forage productivity, more water capture, infiltration, may actually boost shallow soil carbon. So we are seeing this interesting relationship with more biomass, more water capture, more or changed microbial activity, and that translates into more carbon. Another interesting thing that we've been looking at, because we are looking at carbon stock, but we're also looking at other greenhouse gases. For example, methane, because cattle often get a bad rap because they're methane producers, they're ruminants, and so their digestion, they produce methane via enteric fermentation. But what a lot of people don't know as well is that grassland soils, especially healthy grassland soils, have soil microbes that consume methane. They actually remove methane from the atmosphere. So they're called methanotrophs. So literally translated, they're methane eaters or methane consumers. And most grasslands, if they have healthy soils, are net consumers of methane. So in this graph here, for example, all these negative values are a good thing. The more negative it is, the more methane that's being scrubbed out of the atmosphere. So when we took soil from our AMP pastures and the neighboring pastures, and looked at the rates of methane consumption, interestingly enough, we found higher rates of methane consumption in the soils that have been managed under AMP grazing. So it means these pulse grazed pastures where producers are intensively stalking and moving their animals frequently, those soils, because of the microbial communities, they're actually removing more methane from the pastures. And that difference was particularly apparent when we looked at lab incubations at higher soil temperature. So if you think about climate change and warming, like we had last year with these crazy high temperatures, the AMP soils appeared to have the superior methane consumption. So that's important because it can offset at least a portion of that enteric methane production from our livestock. And the other thing in our work, just to be clear, methane emissions were higher with higher stalking rates. So the management decisions are independent of the amount of grazing. It's really about how you graze. So we never want to convince producers to overgraze or to use excess stalking rates. We should be using low to moderate stalking rates and then applying these specialized grazing systems to try to boost plant production, methane capture, and so on. Okay, the last question I'm going to address is, how does agroforestry contribute to carbon storage? And there is a linkage here to actually the livestock sector again. So agroforest is the deliberate combination of forest or forest maintenance or forest production with other forms of agriculture. In some cases, it's cropping, and in other cases, it's grazing. Where you combine trees with grazing, those are called silvopastoral systems. Okay, so we've had a number of studies that have been going on, lots of different locations in Alberta. So I'm just going to compare and contrast a few for you here. So this is a typical silvopasture on the left. So this is very common here in central Alberta. This is intermittent grasslands mixed with forests, mostly aspen forest and some shrublands in there and so on. A very diverse and variable landscape. But in other cases where producers have converted the grassland to cropland, you get cropland, and beside it either planted trees, or in this case, these are naturally occurring trees. So what we call hedgerows. So they're naturally regenerating aspen, balsam, poplar, and so on. So we looked at hedgerows, shelter belts, planted trees, and also silvopastures. And we did a number of, we had both field level, where we went out and measured the carbon and the greenhouse gas flux and all those kinds of things, but we also had another spatial component here. So this is a large landscape level assessment. So here's central Alberta. We had a series of plots. These were big plots, 3 by 7 kilometers in size. And here's an example of one where we literally mapped out the amount of cropland, the amount of grassland, the amount of trees associated with the silvopastures, the amount of trees in shelter belts and in hedgerows. So we quantified this across all of these plots in order to get a gauge on how important are these different agroforestry systems. And again, I just want to touch on some of the highlights here. So one of the interesting things is when we look at the 3 agroforestry systems, so here's hedgerows next to cropland. And so here we're looking at the combination of the hedgerow, the naturally occurring regenerating trees with an annual cropland. And I've already made the point that cropping, so the conversion of a perennial system to an annual cropland really reduces carbon a lot. So there's a little clue. And the shelter belt cropland. And then we have our aspen grassland. So that's our silvopastoral system. Among the 3 systems, the silvopastoral system, so the naturally occurring grassland with these groves of forest, actually stored superior amounts of carbon, okay? At least within the topsoil, okay? Within the top 10 centimeters of soil. So the perennial systems are incredibly important. And perennial applies to both grassland and forests. It's where you've converted to an annual system that we're paying the penalty in terms of carbon loss. We also looked at these greenhouse gas fluxes from the soil, because we know that there's CO2, there's N2O, and there's also methane, as I described, these methanotrophs in the soil that are altering methane emissions. And I won't spend too much time on this other than to say that, these are the CO2, methane, and N2O emissions. And when you combine all three of those greenhouse gases, you get something called global warming potential, which is the bar here on the far right. Global, so that's the aggregate footprint of all three of those greenhouse gases. So a lower global warming potential is better because it means you have a lower likelihood that you're going to promote climate change. So here's our systems: hedgerow, which again contains a cropland and a hedgerow, shelter belt, and the silvopasture, which is basically depicted in this photo on the left. The silvopasture had the lowest warming potential, global warming potential. So this is important because it means that where we have these naturally occurring forests and grasslands actually have, in terms of their footprint, their contribution to global warming is actually lower. It's a good thing for society. We've done lots of other work on agroforestry. For example, we have done an analysis that shows that tree diversity is positively related to soil carbon stocks, especially in agroforests themselves. So the more types of trees you have, the higher the amount of carbon that you're going to have. And the other thing that we've quantified is actually the size of the carbon pool associated with the vegetation within the trees. And to do that, you basically have to model out how much carbon is in the roots of the trees, how much carbon is in the shoot of the tree above ground, because that's all standing carbon stock. And of course, if you look across the three agroforestry systems, so hedgerow, shelter belt, silvopasture, each one of them contains a herbland, so either the grassland, cropland, or cropland, and each one of them contains a forested component. The forested component contains an enormous amount of carbon in aggregate because the green portion of these bars is the biomass that's in trees and shrubs. There's a lot of carbon. And if you look at the aggregate amount, the total amount of carbon in terms of tons per hectare in those forested communities is in excess of 300 tons per hectare because of the contribution of the trees and also the leaf material which accumulates under the trees on the soil surface. So getting back to this spatial analysis that we've done. So we have looked at, well, how do these agroforestry systems add up across the landscape when you're driving across the countryside? So what's interesting is these are the different land use activities in this graph. So we got cropland here on the far right. We've got grassland, we've got silvopastures, we've got hedgerows, we've got shelter belts. What I want to concentrate on, because these two bars are important. For example, in the case of cropland, they represented about 55% of the total land area in our study area when we mapped everything out. So if you literally look across the entire landscape, 55% of it was cropland. But when you look at the total carbon stock, what percent of the total carbon stock did those croplands contain? It was just over 45%. So they represent 55% by area, but only about 46, 47% of the carbon. So they're under contributing to carbon stock. Look at the silvopastures. They represented just over 20% of the aggregate land area, but they actually store almost 35% of the total carbon stock. So those silvopastures, these areas, again, like I'm depicting here in this picture, are incredibly important. And in aggregate, there's around 645 million tons of carbon in those silvopastures. Yes, there's almost 900 million tons in the cropland, but that number is so big because of the sheer amount of land that's been converted into cropland. So puts it into context, hopefully. We also looked at how much forest loss has been going on. So we took archived imagery over a 20-year period and basically remapped it every single year over 20 years. And what we found is that forest clearing is still going on. So here's the amount of annual forest loss annually. So in some years, it's only about 1,000 or 1,500 hectares, but in other cases, it's more like 3,000, 4,000, peaking at as much as 5,500 hectares per year. Most of that clearing is the silvopasture forest. So it's clearing and breaking of areas like in this picture, coming in, bulldozing the trees, burning them, plowing under the pasture, and converting it into cropland. So we then computed the amount of carbon loss. And the carbon losses, again, these data will parallel these bars, but it ranged anywhere from about 0.1 million tons, so that's 100,000 tons of carbon per year, all the way up to 1 million tons of carbon a year that we're losing just because we're clearing forests, with an average of about 400,000 tons being lost. We also did an exercise looking at how much carbon could we additionally store if we took all of the roadsides. So, you know, Alberta's got this grid network, and if we took all the roadsides and just planted shelter belt. So this is a spruce shelter belt. And if we basically planted trees back in all along the edges of these fields, especially along the trees, how much more carbon could we store? So we did that kind of theoretical exercise, and we concluded that if we planted trees along all the road margins, 46,000 kilometers in central Alberta, we could store almost 22 million tons of carbon worth more than $3 billion. And again, this is an underestimate because it's based on a $40 valuation, and we're already at a $50 valuation today. So that valuation is more like $4 billion today. Next year, it'll be 5 billion, and it'll just keep going up as the value of carbon goes up in Canada. Okay, so gonna try to wrap this up because I knew I threw a lot of data at you, a lot of information. There are a lot of
yes.
takeaways here.
Yeah,
so,
you did, Dr. Bork, but just, yeah, if you want to wrap it up, that'd be great.
Yep. I just got 2 summary slides. So 1, grasslands and agroforests are really large storehouses of carbon. They're huge, they're enormous, and they're currently undervalued by society, meaning that producers are not getting paid for maintaining or enhancing them. And because they're not getting paid, it means that if they want to get rid of trees, there's no incentive to keep them. They'll clear them. And if they can make more money off cropland than grassland, they'll convert. Grazing as a land use alters grassland composition, nutrient cycling in all kinds of complex ways, but interestingly enough, contributes to greater carbon accumulation. And of course, forest removal is leading to the loss of a lot of carbon stock. And there are opportunities through the retention or expansion of agroforests, including through shelter belt planting, that we could increase carbon stocks significantly. The policy implications here are potentially huge in that if as a society, we recognize the value of carbon in these grasslands and agroforests, we should be able to incentivize farmers and ranchers to maintain them or even fine-tune their management to increase these stocks. And as I said, the value of carbon is going up. You know, it's currently at $50 per ton. The federal target is $170. I think I said 130 earlier. So there you go. I got my numbers wrong. By 2030, it's going to be valued at $170 a ton, which means you can take all the numbers I gave you and multiply them by more than 3-fold. That's what that carbon will be worth, a lot. That's what I've got. I know that was a lot of information. I'm happy to take any questions or comments. moving forward. Thank you.
No, thank you, Dr. Bork. Like one of the reasons why I had asked you to do this presentation or had put your name forward is that you were extremely detailed and very passionate. And that is what people need to hear, is that if you have a message that you want to put forward, it's very important that you have the best speaker for it. So I'm going to stop the recording and you are able, hopefully, if I can figure this out here, to stop recording. Yep.